there'll be more people who will be joining, but I want to make sure that we use the 2 hours as best as we can. Thank you very much for taking the time to join us during this webinar. My name is Abimbola Johnson. I am the chair of what will be the Independent Scrutiny and Oversight Board. The aim of this webinar is to answer questions that you guys may have around the purview of this board and the general police kind of processes and their response to the plan of action, their dedication to it, and how the board is hoping to be able to work over the next few years. And we are also joined by Jalil Akinwande, who is from the recruitment agency Inclusive Boards that we are working in partnership with to formulate the board over the next few weeks. I just want to check that everyone can hear me. I'm receiving a message from one attendee who's saying that they can't. If you are able to hear, can somebody just write in the chat box to confirm whether or not they can hear? Okay, great. All right, good to know. I think what we can do is we can just start by going round with everyone introducing themselves to make sure that we all know who is who. So perhaps if we start with Jalil, because I think your introduction is the most straightforward, and then we'll go to Dave, and then we'll go to Andy.
Good evening all. My name is Jalil. I'm a senior consultant at Inclusive Boards. So Inclusive Boards is the UK's lead in diversity practice. I am part of the executive search team that specialises in diversity and inclusion. So I've worked in searches such as the Old Vic, the Audience Agency and Choice Support. And I'm honoured to be working with Abby on the Independent and Scrutiny Oversight Board. And honoured to be part of the panel today as well.
Thank you very much, Jalil. And you're going to be able to answer any questions that people may have, specifically around the recruitment process that we've got in place. And for example, what criteria you're going to be using for long listing candidates before they come to me. And I think also you'll be able to give us just an outline of what the timeline is that we're working to in terms of recruitment. Yeah?
Correct.
Great. And next we've got Dave.
Good evening, everybody. So I'm Dave Thompson. I'm the Chief Constable of West Midlands Police up here in Birmingham tonight. But I'm a Vice Chair of the National Police Chiefs Council. And specifically, as far as tonight's concerned, I'm actually the Senior Responsible Officer for the Inclusion and Race Programme for the National Police Chiefs Council. So really pleased to join you this evening. Hoping we can answer loads of your questions around the programme and the work and anything around policing.
Thank you very much, Dave. And last but not least, we'll go to Andy.
Thank you very much. And thank you for joining us, everyone. So my name's Andy Marsh. I'm joint chair of the Race and Inclusion Plan with Dave Thompson. My responsibility is I'm chief exec of the College of Policing. And you might never have heard of the College of Policing, but it's our job to set standards, develop skills, develop leadership, and professionalise the service. So a relatively small organisation, but hopefully with reach over some really important points when we're trying to deliver cultural change in policing. I was formerly Chief Constable of Avon and Somerset Constabulary, and then before that, Chief Constable of Hampshire. And it's my privilege as well to be part of this group.
Thank you very much, Andy. All right, so I think that a good starting point would be just to set out some background around what the plan of action is and around what the board is kind of hoping to do. So I can do that in terms of, from my perspective and with the board remit and its ambitions. And then I think Dave and Andy, maybe if you can give some background as to how it was that the action plan came to be established, or at least the groundwork for it was decided upon. So my background is that I'm a criminal defence barrister. I practice at a chambers called 25 Bedford Row. I was called to the bar in 2011, and outside of working as a barrister, I do a lot of work in terms of anti-racism matters and diversity and inclusion. I do that through a lot of writing that I've done over the last few years, as well as like extracurricular activities and positions that I hold. So I'm a legal trustee for a social justice charity called the Advocacy Academy. I sit as a school governor, and I've also been on an advisory board for the Howard League for Penal Reform, in terms of devising a guide for lawyers to use to be anti-racist in the courtroom. And I think that's an aspect which is really key in terms of the character that will run through this programme as well. It's one thing to follow processes and to follow the letter of the law or the letter of the rules which govern your profession. It's another thing to be actively anti-racist in the pursuit of your profession. And I think that is something that I would like to see the remit of this board push for, which is to see policing actually challenge itself and to fulfill the challenge of tackling racial disparity alongside following the rules, so to speak, of policing. And on top of that, actually pushing for the rules to be transformed so that they themselves also have a goal of pushing towards the removal of racial disparities in the way that the police interact with members of the public. Now, obviously, that's a really ambitious goal. We've got to recognise that we are still going to be working in a society that demonstrates those racial disparities. So there are questions as to whether even ultimately, if this action plan were to be really successful, even if my board were to be able to properly scrutinise independently everything that the police are doing in terms of working into this action plan, I think it's safe to say, and this is based on conversations that I've had with Dave and Andy prior to today, I think the agreement is that there probably still will be racial disparity which is seen in policing, unfortunately, because we work in an imperfect society. But certainly what I don't want to see is a police service that continues to extrapolate and to expand upon the racial disparities that already exist. So that's my introduction. That's kind of a rough idea of what I'm looking for this board. And what we have are 6 vacancies which are available. Hopefully you've seen from the recruitment packs, which I trust you've all read before signing up to this webinar. But if not, then I hope that you'll be able to read them afterwards. But they outline the 6 positions which are available for applications until the 5th of December at 1 minute to midnight. So Dave and Andy, if you could just set out, how is it that the plan of action, the idea for the plan of action came about, and what is the kind of aspirations that you guys have in your roles as MPCC and College of Policing members?
So Andy, if I start off and Andy will add to this. Well, clearly it's probably just worth saying just a little bit about National Police Chiefs Council and how it fits into this. So that, you know, we often talk about the police force, the police service. The reality is there are 43 English and Welsh police forces and British Transport Police across the country. It's not one organisation. And what the National Police Chiefs Council is, it is the body where chief constables come together to, I would describe, surrender some sovereignty, pool our work together as independent legal entities to come up with things that work in the interest of policing, and we do a considerable amount of that. So all police forces, to varying degrees over periods of time, have been in the spotlight around issues of race. There have been issues where they need to improve. There've been many reports raised in the past. But the background to this really was clearly the seismic events that took place last summer, where clearly these issues were very much kind of turbocharged by the global events around George Floyd. But let's not hide from the fact there were also events, and have been events, that have gone on in UK policing that are just as traumatic and challenging. You know, from my perspective here in the West Midlands, you know, during last summer we had an officer, PC Declan Jones, who serially assaulted and has been convicted and sent to prison for attacking a number of young black men in our communities. So these issues are not just an issue about America. They were issues that were amplified and accentuated. And the demonstrations and public outcry we saw was not just from black people, it was across society around issues of change. And, you know, for the police service, we are often the lightning rod, I think, for social attitudes and changes, because we are the most powerful manifestation of the state in the powers that we've got. And inevitably, that means for ourselves that, you know, it is hugely damaging when we don't have that confidence. And we looked hard at ourselves during that period of time and asked the questions why things haven't moved on, why that narrative still persists, why do black people considerably have less confidence in policing. And so the background of the plan was a commitment by chiefs to galvanise together national work to move this work onto a different level. Our commitment is very much, and the outcome framework chiefs have signed up to, is to have a police service that is anti-racist and trusted by black people. As Abby's talked about, it requires us to tackle racial disparities in policing proactively. and to not exacerbate disparities that already exist elsewhere in society. And we want to come away from the programme with a stronger position for policing, where Black people feel protected, respected, involved and represented in policing. But the programme we recognise needed to be very different, because the police, that commitment is very strong of chiefs, that actually chiefs have signed up to be an anti-racist lead anti-racist organisations. But the construction of the board and the importance of the independent oversight group is really, we wanted to bring in really strong, robust and authentic challenge to the work we do, because policing is not representative of the communities it served. It's not representative of Black people. There are not sufficient people in positions of authority. And so the construction of the board and the governance sees, I think, kind of three key boards linked together. Representation from our own staff through the stakeholder group. The board that oversees the programme, we delegate responsibility of chiefs. And then clearly the ISOB that Abimbola Johnson tonight will recruit, which is the critical lens in that champions the community voice into making sure this programme is authentic and commitments are seen through. So that's the background and the aspiration from the National Police Chief Council's perspective.
Thanks, Andy. Did you want to set out the role of the College of Policing and then also the background from that perspective too?
Well, Dave's given you a really good sort of explanation of the structure of the programme, of why we've got to where we are. I'm going to start off with a personal story, if that's all right. And I was sitting at home immediately in the aftermath of the death, and we now call it a murder of George Floyd. And the first I heard about it was when my daughter pushed her mobile phone across the table and said, "Dad, did you do that?" If anything drives home to you the sort of global meaning of the word police and the way and that's associated with me and who I am and what I stand for, it was that moment. And it's too easy to say, not here, not in the UK, it's a different model of policing. Dave's given his accounts. At that time, I was Chief Constable of Avon and Somerset. The first thing that happened when I got to Avon and Somerset was me sitting down with the sisters of a man who was murdered, a preventable murder by racists, where the police had failed him, Bijan Ibrahimi, and promising to do everything I could to put that right and make sure we learnt from it. But then we had a man called Dean Teo, who was brutally beaten up in his own neighbourhood in Weston-super-Mare. And I would say the police attending jumped to all of the wrong conclusions and arrested Dean, beaten up in front of his family. And off that incident, we launched, and we can have a debate about whether it was the right thing to do, but it was well-intentioned, some unconscious bias training, where I significantly tried to move my organisation to challenge themselves and have some empathy for what it was like to be Black and live in Britain or Weston-super-Mare or London or Birmingham or anywhere. And Judah Dunby was tasered in Bristol. And all of these incidents, my George Floyd's moments, absolutely brought it home to me that this needed substantial change to deal with the mistrust. So after I saw this video clip my daughter showed me, and I've grown up in a policing world where in the earlier days we were responding to Stephen Lawrence, but outcries around race and racial disparity tended to go in a secular nature. It absolutely occurred to me that this is not a time for more fine words, this is a time for action. And so certainly I and other chiefs and Dave encouraged Martin. I was chief in Bristol right then. Little did I know that the statue of Colston was to be toppled days later, but that's a different story all of its own. But I hope you heard me making anti-racist comments in my response to that incident. So I encouraged Dave and Martin that we needed to set up a program like no other. And some people will be saying, come on, Andy, this is more fine words now. Why should we believe you now? Dave's given you the structure, but there's a lot different now. We might come on to it, Abby, but this concept of independent scrutiny and oversight by an empowered, inquiring, liberated board chaired by yourself, that's one of the things that's different. I'm happy to talk about the other things. I personally think that one of the antidotes to mistrust is transparency and openness, and that's what I'm sure you will bring to this, and with great candor and honesty to get us to live up to the fine words that you'll hear tonight. I've subsequently got the job at the college, and obviously the job at the college is to set standards, to develop programs of learning, to develop supervisory standards, really to empower people to deliver cultural change. And if I hear one thing from the Black community, I've heard one thing in my career, it's that we need to undergo cultural change. That's what Dave and I are committed to do.
That's great. Thank you very much, Andy. Okay, I think the first question that everybody is probably wanting to really get stuck into, which is a big topic, but I think it's important that it's tackled head on, is institutional racism. I think both of you have used the phrase anti-racist or anti-racism in your answers. From my perspective, I don't think that there's such a thing as having an anti-racist programme if the premise of it is not footed in tackling institutional racism. Now, just to be clear and to make sure that we're all dealing with the same definition, that's the barrister in me, trying to make sure that I define the terms before we move on to substantive discussion. I'm just going to remind everyone of the definition of institutional racism, in particular as it applies to policing. And it's a phrase which kind of was coined or was an academic concept that started really in the 1960s when people started to look at racism as being more than just individual interactions between one person and another, but actually as racism as being something which is permeated through processes and procedures and systems. And that if you are going to aim to tackle it, you need to tackle racism on those levels. So what I'll do is I'll read out the definition of institutional racism, which comes from William Macpherson's definition in the Stephen Lawrence inquiry on the 4th of March, 1999. The collective failure of an organisation to provide an appropriate and professional service to people because of their colour, culture, or ethnic origin. It can be seen or detected in processes, attitudes, and behaviour which amount to discrimination through unwitting prejudice, ignorance, thoughtlessness, and racial stereotyping. Now, if we look at the aims of this plan of action and the fact that there are work streams that we can see which deal with internal culture and inclusivity, which deal with community engagement, which deal with the use of powers, and also deal with protection in terms of police interaction with Black people as victims, witnesses, as well as the suspects, then from my point of view, this is a plan that will only work with the acknowledgement that there is an issue of institutional racism in policing in England and Wales. And I think that we have, in recent times, heard a reluctance from leaders in policing to accept that that is an area that the police fall short in. And so I'll hand over to both of you, Dave, and to Andy. Is that a definition that you accept does describe the issues that we see in policing?
So I think I'd start by going back to what the programme is about, and then I will address the specific issue. So we've set up a programme that is around being anti-racist. It's not about individual behaviours and actions alone. It is about the policies, the structures, the way policing works. It's a broad-ranging piece. I think we want, as always in the programme, to build on strengths, commitment, but at the same time, we're not going to shy away from those sort of challenges. I'd equally say that, one of the things that I think it has been dangerous about the use of the term institutional racism overly used is that we've got to be careful that we don't see every disparity as a result of racism. I think, as you said right at the start, Abby, that we will probably end up in a position where there are still disparities in how the police work, because we don't police a fair and equal society. We try and police it as fairly as we can, but there will be disparities that are not beyond the control of policing. So I think this programme, from my perspective, and I kind of do touch on the language carefully, that I think we will have aspects of this programme that will identify disparities that we might be able to explain. I think we'll have some disparities in this programme we might not be able to explain, and we really need to. I think institutional racism, systemic racism, and structural racism in society are also about this programme and how they affect policing. And so, from my perspective, I have a reluctance sometimes around the kind of big label that policing is institutionally racist, because it becomes the zero-sum moment that explains everything. I think this programme will straddle across those issues, but be under no illusion that the programme is focused on reform of our organisation, and where there are attributes and aspects of the organisation that display institutional, structural, or broader systematic racism, then we will call that out on the programme as we go through. So that's my perspective around it. I often find the all-encompassing statement doesn't nuance the strengths that exist in policing, but nor do I shy away from the fact this programme is exactly about those things and calling them out as we pull them through at each stage of the work.
So before we move over to Andy, Dave, I'm going to push back a little bit. So in terms of what I said, I started with the definition of institutional racism from William Macpherson. And just to go back to that, what he's describing there is there an acceptance that there has been a failure in policing to provide an appropriate and professional service to people because of their colour, culture, or ethnic origin? Now, I hear what you're saying in terms of the fact that there might be vestiges of racism or other disparities that you see, even if this plan were to be completely successful, even if everything were to be put into this plan, everything was to be duly respected because of the wider society. But we're not talking about the wider society at the moment, we're talking specifically about policing and about this particular definition. And bearing in mind as well, the Home Affairs Committee report, which has come out earlier this year, which was the update on the Macpherson report, which highlighted the fact that of the 70 recommendations, the police have struggled to implement those 70 recommendations either in totality or in terms of pace. So would you accept that policing is at the moment falling short and that it does have an issue of institutional racism? I do understand what you're saying in terms of there being a discomfort. If you said that again, I think I spoke over you.
No, no problem. I think we both overlap. So I think perhaps, well, we clearly are falling short in that service. The confidence is much lower in communities. The broader outcomes for not just the communities that we serve, but our staff clearly are as well. You know, as an internal organisation, we still, I wouldn't say, providing the same institutional organisational justice. So from my perspective, what I would say is those attributes and issues that are raised about, are there issues about the organisation and how it works institutionally and the Macpherson definition? Do those issues apply to policing? Of course they apply to policing as part of this work. That's absolutely what we've got to be focused on, because it is a broader programme of that. I think the bit I nuance around it is that I will always, through this work, want us to call out and look at the evidence base on that. And I think that's really important, because sometimes the disparity will not be about policing. And I think many things are often, kind of placed in that prism. But sometimes it will be. And the commitment I give you to it is where it is an institutional issue that we call out and we see the attributes of institutional racism in it, this programme will call it out and we're really clear where it arises. I suppose the issue is my reluctance often is to kind of throw the whole organisation into a great big definition and say that's where we are, because I think there are nuances across this. I think there are absolute disparities we'll explain, but there are absolutely institutional issues about how policing works, where institutional issues of racism will be present, and that is absolutely what the programme is there to challenge. So there's no shy away from that, and there'll be no shy away of calling out that when we identify through the work.
Thank you, Dave. Can I go to you, Andy, now, please?
I'll try and keep this simple, Abby. I think if you disassemble that very well thought through definition of institutional racism, and if as a really high quality barrister, if you led me through it line by line, do you agree? Do you agree? I'm going to say yes to everything, because actually policing has had an issue with race where you just look at the figures. There is a collective failure, a lack of trust, a disproportionality. I think Dave's point that society is complex and there are many reasons for disproportionality and unfairness, it is something we all need to bear in mind. So point one, we absolutely will not shy away from calling out failings where we see failings. But if I move into the pragmatic leader that I want to be to this programme, I want a difference for the Black communities of England and Wales in their dealings with the police. If we're to achieve that, we do need to deliver change across our institutions. Policing is an institution. 44, as Dave said. How am I going to do that? Well, I do believe that I've done it in Hampshire and I've done it in Avon and Somerset. And actually, if I was to say to you, policing is institutionally racist and let's write a newspaper piece on it, that would probably take me some considerable distance to winning some more confidence that I was able to do this for the black communities in the black communities. However, how long would that confidence last? Because this change is going to take, I think we all know, this is going to take years to deliver. So if I'm to be effective to move policing, as I have moved two police forces, I think not in considerable distance, then actually those people within the policing have to trust me to do some things they might not want to do to give me a chance. And I think from a really practical point of view, Abby, if I was to publicly declare that policing is institutionally racist, I think at that point I become an awful lot less useful to actually delivering meaningful change within policing. And actually there's a lot there to discuss, but that's my honestly held view.
So do you think that there's been this kind of reluctance from leaders in policing to accept that terminology because of their concern around people disengaging from discussions and disengaging from actual involvement in moving things forward?
I couldn't possibly supposed to speak for every person that's ever made an utterance on this. So I speak for myself in it. And actually, I was one of the officers that sat down in the training that was mandated post Macpherson. Now, because of the way that it was mandated and the way that it was delivered, actually, I'd say not me, but I would say that, wouldn't I? I could see that lots of people in the room undergoing that training, they frankly rejected it in the way that a body would reject a splinter, and they didn't accept it. Now, actually, the art or the skill of leadership is to prepare the contexts so that people are prepared to go to places which they know they have to. And actually dealing with the instances of that caused massive local unrest in the police forces that I've led, I do believe that I succeeded in taking my colleagues, thousands of people, to places which they didn't necessarily want to go at the start. And that's what this program has got to be about. It's not simply about winning an academic argument. It's about delivering real change for the communities that we're here to serve.
Yeah, I think from my perspective, I think a key aspect of this is, and something that I've seen in conversations with police officers, is leaning into that discomfort that people may have around the terminology. And I think a success measure for this plan would be much more open and frank discussions around racism coming from senior leaders in policing, but also the kind of average Bobby on the beat, so to speak, becoming much more confident in accepting that there are shortfalls in policing and the use of that type of language, because then it actually acknowledges that the trust deficits that we see from people who belong to Black communities are because of the fact that a lot of these matters are very real. It's not all in their head. These are factors that they have felt the effect of because there is this issue around racism that affects the way they interact with the police. And also, I think then it shifts the gaze away from centering the comfort of the average, frankly, white police officer, and acknowledging that what needs to be looked at is the perspective of the people from Black communities, both within policing and external to policing, that this plan is aiming to tackle and to gain the trust of. Dave, you have your hand up. Come to you before moving on to the next question. Yeah.
Can I look? Makes a really good point. I absolutely recognise and acknowledge the disproportionality, the harm, the lack of trust. And that's why this programme is incredibly important. But actually, the programme's got to be about more than fine words. It's got to be about delivering real change. If anyone has watched me work, when I'm talking about race and disproportionality and fairness and justice, I'm not for protecting fragile egos of white police officers. I'm actually for moving people and taking them to some uncomfortable places. I too Abby, are weary of where we have procedures. Actually, how do we develop that cultural competence and awareness and empathy so we police in a far more appropriate way? So you won't find me shying away from hurt, inappropriate behaviour, disproportionality. It's just actually a point about how do we take their workforce to that place.
So Abby, there's a really good discussion on the chat, but I've been trying to read as we go through. So, you know, I think, you know, you are quite rightly kind of poking us quite hard around this one, and rightly so, and there's some good discussion there. So you know, I think the precision on language and what we use is absolutely right on this. I think, you know, when we deal with US colleagues, they talk about racial profiling, we talk about disproportionality. It's really interesting that sometimes we do select words that make us more comfortable. So institutional racism does make us feel very uncomfortable. It's the racism term, and it really kind of hits hard. And I think Andy's right. You know, one of the challenges I think policing's got is, you know, kind of everybody has got a view on what we do. And sometimes being in policing, and particularly, you know, the last few years, that there's a lot of noise in, and what I think we've got to do as leaders is kind of face up to the issues we're not getting right. So I absolutely accept we are doing this program because the trust Black community has is considerably lower in us. We are doing this program, we'll probably talk about later, that it is focused on Black people. It is not around all ethnic minority communities, although our intention is things were broader, because we recognise there is a very specific issue with Black communities here. And nor do we sit down and say this is bad apples, it's a few things, it's here. Because actually, you know, there are two white chief constables on this call. The representation at chief constable level, we know Mike Fuller, who was a chief of Kent when I was but a lad in policing, a long while from being chief constable, was the last Black chief constable that we've had in policing. So our organisation institutionally is quite white and male. So inevitably, when we look at those definitions around disparities, you know, when we look at the concepts of institutional racism, structural racism, and systemic racism, that is present across policing in all those levels. So the bit you see is almost this, you know, the desire for one of us to plant a card on policing. And of course, I've said that there are 44 police forces, and you know, they're all at very different positions around it. But I think the point I'd come back to and say is the program is deadly serious. That we want to explain why we operate if it's disparity, but if it is institutional racism, and there are examples, and that will exist in policing. There's no denying that there is. Then the aim of this program will be to call it out. My expectation of the board is we have that debate and discussion. But I kind of like Andy. I think just trying to arrive at, you know, there we are, and that's policing, and that there are all the issues that we're dealing with. That, you know, I don't think in itself is helpful around the language. But I don't deny all those things are present in policing.
So if I can just change up the conversation just for a moment, because obviously we have Jalil here from Inclusive Boards. Jalil, could you just set out what the timetable is for recruitment for those who are unaware? So obviously people are aware of the fact that we have the 5th of December deadline for applications. Could you let people know what the chronology of events will be for recruitment?
Of course. So, as Abby said, the deadline for all applications will be on the 5th of December. The process for shortlisting will start week commencing the 6th, where we will seek clarity from candidates. We have made allowance to the timeline for Christmas closure. So candidates will be made aware of the outcome around mid to late of January. Applications being considered for interviews will go through a vetting process, after which successful shortlisted candidates will be invited to an interview. All vetting is undertaken by the NPCC. Interviews will start week commencing the 31st of January 2022. Candidates being considered for the role will undergo further vetting, and then Inclusive Boards will contact the successful candidates week commencing the 21st of February 2022.
Thanks, Jalil. And if people have any questions during the recruitment process, if they want to know more about how to structure, for example, their cover letters, how will they be able to contact you?
So I can be contacted via email, and it will go straight to our admin inbox, which is appointments@inclusiveboards.co.uk, where I will give potential candidates 15 minutes with myself to learn about how they could present their application, and any potential thoughts to make sure it is readable for the Independent Scrutiny and Oversight Board.
Thanks, Jill. And another question for you that we've seen is, so first of all, could you put that email address into the chat just so that people can be able to scroll up and find it? And then another aspect is, of course, we've got 6 vacancies for the board. I've indicated in the recruitment packs what the kind of job descriptions are and what I hope the experiences are that people have when they consider themselves for those aspects. But people will be wondering, do they need to apply to a specific position, or is there wiggle room in the way that you're longlisting candidates?
So it's a very good question. So no, they don't need to apply for just one role. As long as they identify in terms of the criteria which is set in the personal spec, in terms of what role they would like to apply for, they can apply for 2 roles. And I guess the next question will potentially be, do I need to create 2 different cover letters? The question is no. You can put everything into one cover letter, as long as you state on top of the cover letter the roles that you're potentially looking to apply for.
I should also say that inclusive boards will be longlisting candidates, and they'll be looking at the applications anonymously. So in other words, stripping out the personal details that can be identified for people, just sort of seeing the people who may fit the criteria initially. That information then gets passed on to me, and the shortlisting process would then begin at that point. And that's when we'll start contacting people and inviting them for interviews. So when you go through from the long listing aspect of things and you get through to the shortlisting, it might be that you had thought that you would be suitable for one role, but when I'm putting the board together with the interview panel, actually another aspect of it is to look at how the board will work together really well. So maybe some shifting around. So actually, if you can be as flexible as you can in terms of your application process and indicating where you'd be happy to work, that's useful as well for us in terms of putting people into the various positioning for the role. A question that's come through is, where can the Equal Opportunities Monitoring Form be found?
So that form can be found on our website on Inclusive Boards. So once you are about to submit your application, it will take you through to that page, and then you can put in all the relevant information in there.
Okay, great. And thank you very much to Wendy. Wendy McPherson, who is answering questions in the chat, is also from Inclusive Boards. So she is helpfully fielding questions that you may have around the parameters of the process as well. All right, so people have thankfully started using the Q&A function on the Zoom. Can I ask people to please put your questions into that Q&A, because it's difficult for me to monitor the chat and to find the questions which are being directed to the panel rather than more general discussion that's happening amongst yourselves. So dealing with the first question that's come through, it's around institutional racism. How can institutional racism be tackled without first accepting that it exists? Discussion around disproportionality are avoiding the core issue. So I think that although I accept it wasn't maybe as clear initially from the answers that we were getting, there is an acceptance that there is an issue with institutional racism, and that is what the action plan is hoping to tackle. But I think that actually a nuanced kind of point which is being put forward through this question is that discussing disproportionality avoids the core issue. So obviously disproportionality highlights the end results that we see, but the aspect of institutional racism talks about the causes and the questions around the systems and so on in the processes. So hopefully the answers which have come through so far demonstrate that the plan of action will be focused on those aspects of things. The next one that we have says, thank you for your authentic response, Andy, in relation to the question on institutional racism. Going forward, we need to support the police in perspective shifting and putting systems in place to understand and recognise biases and prejudice in ourselves, tools for tackling discrimination, bullying, harassment and racism. Right, so the next question that we have here is, what is the roadmap to developing the full plan? What stage is it at? And will there be a consultation element that will be an opportunity to highlight some of the challenges being presented in the chat? If I could build upon that question, I think that that is an area that needs to be improved around this plan of action, which is that I don't think that there has been sufficient public information shared around what's actually going into the plan at the moment, and what the processes are and what the aspirations are. So I understand after some feedback for myself that we should see information going up on the MPCC and College of Policing's websites around the action plan, around the aims. The police ISOB, my board, ISOB has a website up, which is policeisob.co.uk, and what I will be doing through the board is making sure that if there are any documents, if there are any aspects which are coming up which we can share with the public, they'll be immediately available on there. But the question here, which is what is the roadmap to developing the full plan, and what stage is it at? If we could deal with that, I think Dave, that might be a question that you're happy to take, and then Andy of course can fill out afterwards if there's anything more to add from the college.
Abby, I'll pick that up. There's just one. I was looking at the chat, but I wonder if at some stage you might just want to touch on the vetting, because I know a number of people are a bit worried about what we're going to do on vetting. So that's one I've seen. So we are very, very conscious around the plan that we talked about the genesis of this, and we're more than 12 months past that point. And people like me are quite uncomfortable we've not been able to kind of put something out in the depth we would like at this stage. I suppose a couple of bits really. When we set the plan up, the work around the plan and the team, obviously that we largely mobilised work, teams around this, probably in about January this year to a large degree. There was some precursor work. Our intention at the time was to not develop the full plan until we had the ISOB in position, because we were very keen. Policing didn't just come up with a plan, ta-da, here it is, this is what we're doing, and then we recruit an independent oversight board after the event. I think the ISOB took a little bit longer. From our perspective, there's nothing to do with Abby to mobilise that through. But our intention in the plan that we set out to Chief Constables was to publish where we were at, the position on the plan before the end of this year, and that is still our intention. The approach that we want to take with it is to be iterative. So we will put a public-facing document saying this is our commitment. And I've talked about the outcomes framework that's been done already by the College of Policing that chiefs have signed up to. We've got that in place. There are limbs of the plan that are going to be about internal culture and inclusivity. There's the use of police powers. There's a community engagement element, and we've also agreed to add an additional limb about protection from victimisation for Black people. That actually is one of the areas that we'll develop through the Protect, and that's started a little later off the plan, but that will be there. So we'll publish the first position on this before Christmas, and then what I'm hoping to do as a board is that we iterate the plan, and that we will have particular phases where it's revised, it's republished, it's reset out, where we bring the experience and skills from the independent oversight board into this. So there is work in place. There are some things that we picked up and developed. So there was work going on around Taser, there was work going on around Stop Search, there's been work going on through the Uplift board about recruiting. Some of that will be marshalled together as well as the new work, but we will have a position set out around the plan in December that will be external, and then we will work with your board, Abby, to develop that into, to stretch its ambition, to shape it, and inevitably, if you look at the outcomes framework, add new limbs of activity during the life of the work.
Thank you, Andy. Did you have anything to add to that answer?
Just want to add that people are asking about accountability, and Abby, I think, rightly pointed out to Dave and I, look, why are we not seeing anything publicly about what's happening? Which I think is a very fair point, and to me, we've got a fair bit, not enough, but some information about the timeline and the glide path for this on the College of Policing website. So I'd urge you to have a little look at that. But policing is, there's some bad things or some negative things about our culture, and you see that. Maybe that I wrote a piece in the national media about our culture and why it needs to change last weekend or the weekend before last. So I'm certainly not in denial of any problems, but there are some positive things as well. One positive problem, we roll our sleeves up. One of the drawbacks of that is that we quickly rush on to the next problem. I'm pretty sure that this board will make sure that we keep our noses to the grindstone of the importance of this issue. But if we were to rush to knock out an action plan without actually giving it proper scrutiny of this board, I don't think it would be the plan that our committees deserve and our communities need. And so one of the reasons why we haven't seen the plan come out yet is because it needs to be scrutinised. But the pace, I believe, pick up very substantially once the board is appointed and can scrutinise things for us.
And as I understand it, by the 14th of December, there should be more publicly available information containing more substantive information around the aims of the plan. Questions which have come up have included how my board will be accountable and whether there's any purview for public kind of feedback and feed into the programme. So within the structure, what has been created, what will be created by the Independent Scrutiny and Oversight Board is a community diversity and inclusion forum. And so over the last few weeks, since my appointment was announced, I've been meeting with individuals and with organisations that are interested in pushing forward anti-racism work, and specifically within the criminal justice system and within policing. And the aim is to have at least quarterly meetings between my board and that forum to ensure that the board itself is accountable to Black communities and to organisations that we are representing when we have seats at the table during these discussions, so that we're kept abreast of work which is ongoing at grassroots levels and important reports and research, apologies. Ooh. To make sure those being looked at. Sorry, just 1 second. Oh, sorry, that was very embarrassing. Oh, so we've got our forum, which will feed into us, which will hold us accountable. And in turn, Andy and Dave, through their roles on the College of Policing and via the MPCC, thank you, have soft powered that they will be able to use to push to ensure that the recommendations which are put forward by my board are duly respected in those processes moving forward. We've had some questions which have come through with regards to previous inquiries and reports that we have seen, so notably the Macpherson report. We've also got the David Lammy review. 40 years ago we had the Scarman report and so on. I think it's fair to say that people feel quite reported out when it comes to matters of police scrutiny and research and so on. And so Dave and Andy, from the policing perspective, how can people be assured that this action plan is not just going to be more of the same, and that there will actually be an emphasis on action? What's being done to push that forward?
Well, the proof of the pudding is always in the eating, as they say. You know, we've got to, I think, demonstrate that through. So I suppose the starting basis, I would say, this is something chiefs have decided to do themselves. When you listed the other areas, they were all external issues to policing, where somebody coming along through the first inquiry, HMIC reports, Haskell, others, and said, you need to do this. So the decision to initiate this work has been done by the chief constables of the country, recognising it's there. It is not externally thrust upon us. The creation of the ISOB is the intent, desire of chief constables that we have that body there. So I think that is very, very different than where we've been. I talked about the outcome framework. We've made an active commitment to be an anti-racist organisation and talked about the commitments we want to make. They are long-term and enduring around that. I think in terms of the plan, you know, genuinely the work we've got to do is to be at the test we were discussing with the team today. The test, you know, is, well, you know, if we do this, what will the measurable difference be for Black people of doing this activity? We might think this is a better way of doing it. What will the difference be? So that challenge is there in the plan. But, you know, I also have to be really honest and say, you know, this is about our collective commitment and the work we do, because inevitably you know, as Andy said, that this isn't something we'll fix in 18 months worth of work. We did, you know, the kind of history of black people and discrimination is considerably longer than any of our lifetimes, and sort of change around this is substantial. Our challenge will have to be to keep a rolling vision of this working from the chiefs, to say this is the current action plan, this is what follows next. I think we will have to find ways of refreshing the programme. In reality, every 2-3 years, if we don't find a way of spicing it up, shaking it up, bringing a new momentum and energy to things kind of become stale. And that's always been the danger on this, because policing is buffeted by many events, many issues. We've got to find a way of locking that in. And you know, Simon Israel's made the comment, hasn't he? You know, described me and Andy as progressive, but what's going to happen when we go? So thank you for coming announcing we will go at some stage. But you know, we've got to refresh the leadership in the programme. There is a gap in leadership in the programme, that it is underrepresented at chief officer level, and part of our plan is to drive representation through here. So we can't answer the question, you know, in lots of, you know, definitively say here it is, but I think there are very different attributes here that the leadership responsibilities we're all going to have on the programme is we've got to keep driving it forward. And that will include, actually, from my perspective, and, you know, we're recruiting, you know, the ISOB today, it will be succession planning in the ISOB at some stage. It will have to stay fresh. It will have to keep an energy. But I think chiefs have signed up to some quite big commitments here. And, you know, the ISOB is going to hold our feet to the fire around it.
Thank you very much for that, Dave. Just going back to the questions that we've had come through. So some more questions that we've received here around vetting. So if we just go back to Jalil to deal with that, it's fair to say, isn't it, Jalil, that it's the MPCC side of things that's dealing with the kind of processes of vetting rather than inclusive boards?
Correct.
Okay.
Yes.
And so if I'll just direct people to the chat, and hopefully there you'll see answers which have come through from Tina Nicholson, who has explained the level of vetting which will be used for this programme. And can I also just take this opportunity to say that from my perspective, in terms of board members, the fact that anybody has previous convictions, please don't feel that that precludes you from applying to this board. My view very much so is that actually, if somebody has had an interaction with the criminal justice system as a defendant and has then gone on to be convicted and has come out of the other end of that, that is a really positive lived experience that could ultimately benefit the board. If you can demonstrate that you've come out the other end of that, that you have then worked towards being rehabilitated back into society, and that you are positively invested in the idea of pushing for anti-racism work to be taken seriously in policing, then that it could only be a positive. And in fact, it's something that I would encourage anybody to outline very clearly in their cover letter what steps they've taken since coming into contact with the system in that way. So hopefully that assists with answering that question. All right.
Can I just add to that, Abby? Just so we are not recruiting people to be employees of the police, but clearly what we do need to ensure, you know, in terms of the board, that there are, you know, there are not going to be some serious issues that would damage public trust and confidence will be to appoint people. I think you're absolutely right. You know, we will. Our general view would be, you know, it would be very exceptional if there was a vetting issue that would preclude somebody being a member of this board. We want an authentic board. But what I would say to people through any vetting process is, please be really truthful with us, because actually that one of the biggest problems we sometimes have is people have something, perhaps a minor conviction or something from the past, and don't tell us, and that can raise, you know, issues. So please, I know it's a trust issue and it's tricky. Please take the assurance we're not trying to weed out and end up with a whole group of people that have not got critical things to say, and that people haven't had, you know, adverse experiences or have been convicted of crimes. It's not about that. We can all kind of guess the current topical issues that we have to be alert to when we appoint people to high-profile roles. I would want people to feel reassured and not threatened by vetting.
So there's a question here around the function of the forums. So I'll take this one, asking how people working on these issues influence this area of work if they're not on the board, and would I consider having a shadow board made up solely of people with lived experience of over-policing, given full training and support, so there's no risk of any lived experience members on the main board being seen as tokenistic. I'm not sure that I fully understand the latter part of that question, I'm afraid. The first part of the question asking, in terms of the forums, how can those working on these issues influence this area of work if they're not on the board? I hope that's been answered. That the idea is that the board is accountable to the forum. The legitimacy of the board only comes from properly representing the feelings and the priorities of Black communities. And so if we are disengaged from that, then really it's not a legitimate board at all. So the forum will hopefully hold us accountable through that. And in terms of the shadow board, I don't know if there can be some clarification which is added to that question, because I'm afraid I don't quite understand the premise of that aspect of that question there. There were questions which were sent through in advance, so while I wait for those to come through, I will answer. We can turn to some of these. So there's an anonymous question actually which has come through, which is asking around the funding for the board. So where is the funding for the board coming from? Is it government funding, considering that it's meant to be independent? So Dave, I know that you've marked this as a question that you would like to answer.
Yeah, so it's paid for by police forces. So the college is funded separately from forces. There are aspects of the resourcing on the programme that college policing pays for, but chief constables are paying for the programme out of their budgets, which will be currently paying for the current team, currently fund the work we're doing. We've got a number of posts supporting, and we pay for the whole lot. So it is paid for by policing.
I think that goes back to one of the themes of questions that we've seen, which came through from people in advance. They were given the opportunity to send questions to us in advance. One of the themes really was around the independence of the board in this programme. So what I just wanted to explain, in case anybody hasn't seen the organisational structure which is set out in the recruitment packs and is also repeated on the ISOB website, the function of the ISOB is not to create the plan, it's not to sell the plan in any way, it's to hold the police to account in terms of their implementation of the plan. The actual grunt work of fully developing the plan, of pushing police forces to adopt it and pushing them to speak about it kind of openly and so on, that falls within policing. It's really important for this board to prioritise where its focus is, and the focus of the Independent Scrutiny and Oversight Board is on making sure that the voices of Black communities are being properly listened to in the functioning of the plan. And so that its independence comes from the fact that there's no best investment by the board to push for the action plan come what may. The purpose of the board is to say whether or not it's a legitimate plan and whether or not the police are meeting the targets which have been set out against the plan. So really, like that function, that pushing towards ensuring that it's adapted and ensuring that it's properly prioritised within policing, that's where you see Dave and Andy's roles coming in. And that's why it's very important that the people who have joined this webinar are Dave and Andy, given the seniority of their positions within the College of Policing and the MPCC. And Andy, I see that you have your hand up, so I'll go to you.
I was just quickly going to add to what Dave said on the funding. Dave gave a sort of statement of fact. What my experience in this respect is that when I was Chief Constable in Avon and Somerset, I personally, from the constabulary's funds, funded an independent LAMI actually took an accountability and scrutiny position for Bristol, not only about policing, but also around other aspects of disparity associated with race. And I certainly felt it was a legitimate and a productive piece of work to get involved in. And actually, the individual that ended up chairing that independent LAMI view was the individual that chaired the Justice for Judah campaign. And actually, some people have asked in the chat and the questions about, you know, how are you with people who are activists? And actually, we want people who are ambitious for change and prepared to express their dissatisfaction. I think also the police, and you're dependent on it. It's not, we shouldn't be doing that. Actually, one of the things that I think you can do to express and demonstrate that you're taking an anti-racist position is be proactive about tackling racism and be prepared to put resources into it. So I hope that the establishment of the board is viewed with that intent in mind, because I know that actually there'll be lots of views across the community about whether it was the right thing to do or not, but that's our.
Thank you, Andy. Okay, so going to the questions that we've had come through, we've got the question here which says, how important is lived experience? Many boards do not have people with lived experience. That hasn't changed in decades, which they highlight as a reason why they believe that nothing's changed in policing. This is where there's a real lack of trust from the Black perspective. For example, how can the police train others on cultural change when they're white and have never suffered racism, as that's been their experience over the years? Well, what we've been doing through the campaign for recruitment for this is really targeting groups which have a high membership of people from Black communities. And obviously, like, positive discrimination is not legal, and therefore I can't preclude people who don't have lived experience from applying to the board. But I would like to see very kind of qualified people of lived experience putting themselves forward for this board. It would be fantastic to see very strong representation from diverse Black communities on this board, so that not only are people bringing their professional skills to the fore, but also that aspect of lived experience. And that's why I've said, for example, that other things like previous convictions shouldn't preclude people from applying. It's really important that during the discussions, those soft aspects, that personal knowledge of what it is to experience policing in England and Wales as a Black person can also be brought to discussions from the board and to that aspect of scrutiny and oversight, those functions. So yes, I would very, very strongly recommend the people who are of lived experience put themselves forward for this. And once again, this is a process where we're encouraging people to have lots of contact with Jalil, so that if you do have any sort of concerns around the process, if you are unsure around whether or not you're qualified or how to put forward your qualifications, that you do so and just make use of him as a resource throughout this process. Just to give some more guidance in terms of the way that we're going to structure the recruitment process. So after shortlisting, when you get to the interview stage, one aspect that I've been very aware of is that very often interviews highlight people's skills in terms of thinking on their feet and coming up with impressive sounding answers in that moment. I don't think really that would highlight for this board the skill set which is needed from a board which is approaching matters from a scrutineer kind of perspective. And so what we'll be doing is actually sending the questions that we'll be asking in interview in advance to shortlisted candidates who will be invited for interview, so that you have the opportunity to think about the way that you're going to approach your answers, to make sure that you draw upon any experience, any aspects, any research that you're familiar with that you'd want to highlight in that situation. Much like in a board meeting, where you'd be aware of what the agenda is prior to coming to the board, where you'd have had the documents to read, and then you come to the meeting and are able to contribute towards the conversations in that way. So there's nothing about this process which is aimed at tripping people up. There's nothing about this process which is aimed at just thinking about how quick you are in terms of your responses. What we're doing is we're encouraging people who are thoughtful, who are considered, who work collaboratively, who are able to highlight areas that maybe they're slightly weaker in, go back and research, and then bring their research to the table. So it will be a very open, I hope, and very inclusive journey that we're using in terms of finding people through our recruitment process. So we've got some questions around the representation in the forum. Membership of the forum is very open. Yes, I do want regional representation. I'm very aware that very often anti-racism projects, particularly when it comes to policing, can be very London-centric. So I would encourage people from regional areas to join. We're going to have a hybrid method of working in terms of people being able to attend and also to work online in terms of the meetings, and also in terms of the way that the board will work. It's a commitment of 16 hours a month, which is very flexible. So you should hopefully be able to fit it around work, fit it around full-time jobs and so on, and do it remotely as and when you can. There is an expectation that people would come to meetings physically. Depending on the makeup of the board, we can try and find geographical areas which are suitable and for everybody to come to. But as has been put in the recruitment packs, the meetings of the boards will be every 2 months. They'll be scheduled in advance, so hopefully people are able to sort out travel and accommodation, and your expenses are paid on top of the daily rate that you're paid for your work. So even if there is travel to meetings, you shouldn't be out of pocket as a result of travelling down. And we can move the location of meetings as well if we have the kind of like more regional makeup of the board. So things are flexible, and they are working towards ensuring that we have as diverse a range of opinions feeding into the work that we would be doing moving forward. So going back to the questions that we have, and in terms of ones which were sent in advance, we've actually covered, I think, the main meat of a lot of the questions which had come through prior in terms of registration. There was a question that had come up from somebody asking about the role of PCCs and how they would fit into this structure. So in case people don't know, PCCs are police and crime commissioners. They are elected officials who have a statutory function in terms of holding the police to account and scrutinising their roles in a general fashion. And so what I'm really pleased to say is that from the discussions that I've had leading up to today and moving forward, the PCCs are very engaged with this plan of action, and actually they're very open to working with the board and assisting with highlighting and raising and escalating matters using their statutory functions when it comes within their permit. And in the same token, when there are things that they see which fall outside of their statutory function that they think need to feed into the plan of action, they would be able to do so either by contacting the board or even going directly to the programme board and other aspects of that function. So the structure of the ISOB is not to take away from any of the scrutiny power that already exists in the system of policing. Rather, it's to add to that and to hopefully demonstrate a unified approach that can be taken towards policing and scrutiny in general. There's a question which has come through, again, that's asking about the regional aspects of development and so on. Now, another question which has come through from Morvel: does the vetting process look at the applicant alone or their family as well? Tina, I wonder whether you would be able to type the answer for that, please, into the chat, so that hopefully that can be dealt with from that perspective there. Right, I'm going to go back to some of the questions which have been asked in advance while we wait for questions to come through on the live function. All right, so there's a question here: how will you ensure that the police follow through on any recommended changes? Andy, I wonder actually whether that's something that you would be able to answer just by explaining how police standards work and the College of Policing, and what sort of functionality there is there.
So there's probably quite a lot I could say. Has got the power to set standards and agree with, so we can set standards regardless of what chiefs decide to do, although we would clearly use that power with great caution. In terms of standards that we set, Her Majesty's Inspector of Constabulary are responsible for inspecting against those standards. So in terms of, in direct answer to your question, how will the board hold what they said? The first thing is, I'd say that actually we will make sure that data is available to the board that answers the question about, are we doing the things we said we're going to do, whether that's about delivery of training, whether that's about what we really care about, which is less disproportionality in areas we can impact, whether that's about, and this is a big difference with the programme, the protected strand, whether that's about black people better, and they will be protected by the police when they're victims of crime, we can make data available across the piece. We can also work with Her Majesty's Inspector of Constabulary, who will be inspecting against aspects of this plan. I'm absolutely sure of that. So there'll be a wealth of factfulness, inspection reports, and then, I mean, I'd rather we didn't lead too much on this. People will always have lots of anecdote to offer, but actually, whilst the anecdote is important, we got to know about how we rise the tide and the performance of the whole system, not simply, I know someone who had a bad experience.
That's great, thank you, Andy. And I think that there are some questions which have come up around data. So in particular, when you look at the structure of the plan of action, there is an enabling work stream which focuses on data. And then also what I have advertised in terms of board recruitment is a specific function for data and for a data analyst. Dave, could you just explain how the plan of action is using data? Because I think a lot of people probably see that and worry that what's going to be done is a continued sort of repetition of data gathering and analysing whether or not there is a problem, rather than moving towards action and dealing with it. So what's the function of data in the plan of action, please?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, clearly what we're trying to do is, I think we've explained is, MPCC, because there's a lot of discussion about powers and levers. So I'm a vice chair of MPCC. I work to Martin Hewitt. Martin and I cannot tell chief constables what to do. They run independent organisations, and there are 43 of them across the country. The plan comes together as a consensus agreement that we do things. It's a consensus agreement around what the actions are, but we've got to find some way of tracking what's happening and is it working, and also analysing the work through. And a really good example, I think, is the work that's going on currently on the Uplift programme nationally. Now, the Uplift programme has got some overlap with this, and we measure bits of the Uplift programme through it. But we're using that data to understand our disparities. We're trying to understand factors that could be in this place. So, for example, we know that at some of the assessment centres, there's some adverse, the outcomes for applicants are adverse. We've been researching why that is. Actually, there are some more complex factors than race that actually indirectly impact upon people of colour as well in those programmes. So it's to monitor, on occasions it's to dig deeper, it's to make sure we consistently collect. Again, the data on recruitment activities until the Uplift programme has been collated differently by 43 forces. I think people will be surprised in the country how little things are actually truly national and how many things are done at a local level. So it's not, do we just spend ages collecting loads of data to try and have a conversation around whether we've got a problem or not. But actually, we do need to present the data to enable the plan to be monitored effectively. And where we need to, with the great research capability of the College Commission, probably get behind the details and really understand it. So I think it's helpful. I think it will strengthen what we do. It's an area we're working with the College, HMIC, and of course the Home Office to make sure that collection is consistent.
You've mentioned the Home Office there, Dave, and I think that's another theme that has come through in terms of the questioning. So obviously this isn't a plan which is driven by government. As you've mentioned before, it's driven by the MPCC and the College of Policing. And so how does that affect the relationship with the Home Office, and where does the Home Office sit in terms of this plan?
Yeah, so we've been very clear, this is something that's initiated by us. I think that remains a huge strength in this. It's the first time I think we've seen that happen on race issues. I think our intention is to work collaboratively with the government to show what we're doing, to keep the government updated. They are a key stakeholder in this. There are some areas where government is very intrusive around policing on this issue, particularly on the recruitment through the Uplift programme at the moment. Government is investing in policing and wants to see a more diverse workforce. We are clearly the ability to seek an annual data return from policing is a government one, so we need to make sure that's right. And our intention as we develop the plan is to discuss it and continue to keep government informed around the work. Government, as clearly will have some issues in this area they've got to pick up. The race disparities report that was commissioned by Number 10 has got issues for policing in, and we'll clearly want to address those if government pick those up. And also there's the Home Affairs Select Committee that he's obviously made some requests and asked government, and again, we'll need to work through with government around that as well. So there will be a good relationship. We will be constantly working alongside Home Office colleagues, but but equally we see this as our plan. So we have a good level of ownership on this, and there may be occasions where we take a different view for government about how we want to approach an issue, and I think we are operationally independent. So there is some strength, I think, in this place about having our independence in the programme.
And it was a question that I had in the back of my mind when I considered applying for this role, the lack of statutory function. However, if I'm being completely frank, when it comes to anti-racism work, and when it comes to making sure that there is a continued focus on people from Black communities, I think that sometimes, though, that work can move down an agenda. Government obviously has a very wide purview, it has a lot of priorities, it has a lot of things that it needs to look at. Politicians also need to make sure that they are able to stand for election on the basis of matters that the electorate really understand and will actually go to the ballot box for. And what I think that can mean is that it means that the priorities of Black communities are sort of beholden to election timetables and particular priorities that come to the fore. What this does, I'm hoping, is it enables my board to push to ensure that the focus on this plan remains near the top or at the top of the agenda in terms of policing, and that over the course of this tenure, it would never slip down that agenda list. I think it is a positive, actually, on reflection, that it's coming from within policing, because I think also it means that, as Dave has indicated and as Andy has said in the chat as well, it means that really the police become invested in the outcome, rather than it being something which is kind of foisted upon them externally, that they can push back on and they can say, well, we didn't really have much of a problem in the first place. What we're starting from here is the perspective of the police saying, there is an issue and we need to tackle it. And therefore, if the police don't take it seriously and continue to tackle that, they're only letting themselves down in the long run. And I think also it's fair to say that there is a goodwill at the moment within Black communities to feed into this programme. But if this isn't taken seriously, and if this isn't prioritised, then really policing is going to find it very, very difficult in future to engage with us moving forward. And so I think that's where a lot of the strength of this plan comes from, but it's also something which has reassured me as somebody who is external to policing, to actually invest time and effort into the scrutiny aspect of this role. And as the chair of this board, I would ensure that the work which is being put into this by board members is taken very seriously, and would push back if I were to feel as though the plan wasn't being properly prioritised, that the board's work wasn't being properly prioritised. So Gamal, I hope that answers your question, which David had said he was going to answer with regards to what weight the board has in terms of accountability. So questions have come through asking about specific work or training that will be done to bring the board together as a cohesive team. That's something that I'm very attuned to, and I think especially because I imagine there'll be a lot of remote working. So yeah, I will be, one of the roles of one of my roles as chair would be making sure that the team sees itself as a team with the board, regularly checking in, ensuring that the meetings are prioritised in people's diaries. So we'll have meetings diarised long in advance to ensure that people can structure their work and their life balance around that. And there will be a full induction which we put in place for the board, and there will be specific training if needed around various aspects of things. So it's fair to say, isn't it, Dave and Andy, that there is a willingness within policing to allow the board to attend and to view policing in action if that's needed, to contextualise matters, for there to be forced visits if needed. But there'll also be some softer skills which will be provided, such as media training and other aspects like that. One thing that I'm very sensitive to is that very often, if you have people of lived experience who are working very openly on anti-racism projects, it can lead to some backlash and some kind of like negative reactions. And so there'll be functions which will be put in place to ensure that people have access to help and assistance around that if needed, whilst exercising their board functions as well. So the next question that we can go to, I think actually many of these have been answered, so I'll speed through them if I can. What is the relationship between your 2018 plan and this unpublished one? And that's a question that's come through from Simon Holdaway. Dave, are you moving to answer that question, or are you just...
Yeah, I can do. So there is a broader diversity and inclusion plan that policing published and put out there that it was working to. It's more than just race. It was more broad. The debate, we still have an NPCC lead, Carl Folks, who's the Chief Constable of North Wales, who's leading the work on diversity. But the intention of this work, we felt specifically on race, but specifically on Black communities, needed calling out as a specific area of work. We clearly, during this phase have been buffeted also by challenges around how we approach gender. There are other strands of diversity. They're really, really important. We need to continue doing this work. But we felt because of the public confidence issues that existed, this needed some more additional work. It will be, I assure you, publish the work we do. We do work very closely with other NPCC leads to make sure the work's complementary. So we're not backing away from our broader diversity commitments, but this specific piece is focused on Black communities, and we felt it deserved that separate attention.
Okay, another question that's come through is around the role of critical friend as is identified in the organisational chart. So to anyone who hasn't seen that, what you can see in the organisational chart are the 4 work streams, and then working into the workstream leads, you have coordinators, and then you also have critical friends for each of those work streams. So Dave or Andy, are you guys able to explain what those specific critical friends are doing within those organisational charts?
Yeah, so I mean, I think from my perspective, the intention is really that both from stakeholders, staff in the organisation, members of the ISOB, etc., what we're trying to do is add as much value as we can do to the programme, the work streams. And we're really clear that there are strategic leads and work stream leads here who are chief officers, and they're accountable for delivery of that work. But inevitably, the service is not as well, is not as well represented as we'd like to. We need to make sure voices and lived experience are brought to it. We need some challenge in the programs to make it robust. So that's the kind of role what we're seeking with critical friends in the program. And we've used particularly, there's clearly we're recruiting the ISOB in, but we've also, for example, looked at representative leaders within policing to try and provide some critical friend support work to the work streams as well.
Okay, another question which has come through: should a campaigner be successful, would they be expected to limit their activities away from the board in terms of community activities to hold the police to account? Okay, so that's quite a general question. I think that first of all, that's a factually sensitive scenario which each person would need to consider in terms of the remits of the work that they're doing. But I don't see why being on an independent scrutiny board would preclude you from being involved in community activities as well. I actually think those things would go hand in hand, and I would expect that we'd see a lot of applications coming through from people who have that as in their background or even in their day jobs. I think it would only really add to the role. But obviously, there might be a specific scenario that you have in mind that you're thinking of. If you do have concerns around that, again, direct them to Jalil, and he'll be able to discuss with you whether or not there is in fact a conflict of interest that's come through from that. And the next question from the same person: will restrictions be placed on campaigners' activities? For example, should there be a death in custody or a case of excessive force in their community work? Would they be, if they were successful in being recruited to the board? So I think that what that is saying is, if there is a case of death in custody or excessive force in their community, would members of this board then be precluded from working on that? I don't see why they would be. I see those very much as like hand in hand. But again, it depends on what your function is. If you're working as a lawyer and you have a lawyer-client relationship, that might be something that you need to consider from your own professional kind of perspective around things. But again, it's hard to prospectively answer these questions without actually having the particular factual scenarios. But generally, a background in campaigning, a background in speaking truth to police powers, in working in actions against the police would certainly not, from my point of view, preclude you from being able to sit on the board. And I think actually it would only add professional experience to this role when we look at the purview of the board. So I'm going to mark those as answered. What times in the day will board meetings be scheduled? They'll need to be flexible. Once the board has been recruited, those are discussions that can be held with the board to see what jobs people have, what functions they have, whether or not they would prefer to meet on weekdays, weekends, and so on. That's down to the board once we have everything recruited. So again, that's not going to be something which should be preventative to people joining. I'm sure we'll be able to find a way, the 7 of us, to work together and to find spaces of time that work for everybody. Here we go, a specific question here that's come through from Dominique. What is the scope for the ISOB to impact the police qualifications educational framework? This is the new route into the police for police officers. Will there be opportunity for the board to impact on training directly to new officers, as well as current police officers and staff? Andy, we've not heard from you for a while. Do you want to answer that question?
Yeah, I said to Dominique, and that you're doing really well, by the way, reading and hosting this, Abby. But I answered this in the chat, but just to explain a bit of it. So the PEQF is Police Educational Qualification Framework, and it's the way in which all police officers enter policing now, and that's 50,000 over a real opportunity, as I wrote in the media, to change the culture of the service for the better. The College of Policing actually is responsible for setting the curriculum, and the curriculum is under review, and we absolutely will and do include issues around race, inclusion, ethics, whistleblowing, leadership, the code of ethics, and much, much more. But I would expect the panel to want to scrutinise all aspects of policing, and it's one thing saying that you're doing it, how is it delivered, is any good? So we can change the curriculum. What I'd say is there's 3 elements to how they deliver PEQF, to use that again. Firstly is what's in the curriculum. The second is what quality of delivery is there by the partner higher educational institution. And actually, I would encourage chief constables to get all over their HEI to make sure that it is delivering the sort of training they need and expect. So, for instance, when I was chief in Avon Somerset, I made sure that the University of West of England was delivering training and knowledge around race, inclusion, diversity, fairness and justice in a way that absolutely met my expectations and the needs of the local community. And then the third aspect of the new training is how do those officers land in forces? And the force obviously needs to do a lot to make sure the knowledge that they've gained and helps put it into practice. And the old culture, accepting there are strengths to it, doesn't reject all of this new good stuff, this big injection of 50,000 we're getting in. So this is a really exciting area which we can change and develop and improve in the future.
Thank you, Andy. Okay, so another question that we have, and I think this is a really good question. There's so much to be done. How would the ISOB ensure that it doesn't spread itself too thinly and remain realistic about what it can achieve? So I think actually, again, what needs to be reiterated is that the role of the scrutiny board is to scrutinise the police's implementation of the action plan. And so in terms of dealing with the specific problems and the purview of that and the focus of the programme, so first of all, the ISOB would be able to feed back to the programme board as to whether or not it feels that the remit of the action plan is unrealistically wide, or whether the priorities haven't really been properly managed in terms of implementation. But then within the way that the board itself actually operates, we have 16 hours per month for each board member to fulfil their functions, they would be pushing to make sure that there are measurable targets which are being put in place that can actually realistically be fed back on to see whether or not they have been implemented. But the first step in that, and ensuring that the plan doesn't spread itself too thinly, is feeding back on the plan itself and ensuring that it has those measurable, properly targeted aims within the period of time. And that's another question which has come through, which is what is the kind of time frame for this overall? So it's been discussed, hasn't it, Dave and Andy, as being a 4-year plan, but in terms of longevity of the plan, where do you see this plan kind of ending, or how long do you envisage that the plan will be in place for?
I think that's a really hard question. So we have kind of talked on those broader timeframes about 4 years. Do I actually think we'll have said, gosh, we've kind of done everything in 4 years? I don't think we will do. But I think there's inevitable process of refresh at key stages. I always like, in terms of change programs, to try and have something like a 2 to 3 year forward program ahead in our minds. So I think currently the program we'll publish is probably, has got probably a kind of, in my view, about a 2-year window. What the board and the ISOB challenge into the board needs to be is we need to be looking beyond the current plan as we get underway for the next 2-3 year period where the plan should be focused. And I think that's what keeps it alive. I think it's really hard to put a time frame and say this is it, because, as I said at the start, the issues around racism, discrimination, institutional racism, the impact and broad issues in terms of society on Black people are a lot longer than that. We didn't get that to this position in 4 years. One would say it's going to take a lot longer. So I can't answer a hard, fast position. But look at the outcomes framework and the position we signed up to. It's not going to be done in 18 months. This is it. But I think our job collectively is to keep a longer term vision on it, and there does come a point with any program where you've got to say, this one has achieved what we set out to do. Otherwise, it just becomes tired. It kind of moves on. Attention is lost. So this process of continual refreshment is going to be very important for us, I think.
So there is a question here as well that says deaths in police custody. It's an area that's one for the most heinous of abuse. How will the board change the current situation? So again, I think actually the way to frame that is, how will the plan change the current situation? Because again, the meat of the plan and the push for the plan comes from within policing, the board's role to scrutinise. So how will the plan be tackling the area of the racial disparities and the racism that we see in terms of deaths in police custody?
So if I touch on this, and Andy might touch on things like shock doctrine. So the plan currently that will go before the board, there's issues on use of powers. It's not restricted to a specific issue or work stream on custody. It's about our use of force and our use of powers, which is, force. Custody is one of the settings where force is used. It's one of the highest settings where assaults on police happen as well in custody. So that area falls within the powers and issues. But obviously, custody is an area where Andy and the college actually set some very demanding standards for forces. So probably Andy will have a view about how standards play into
that. I think it's something for the panel, the board, where they would like us to put lots of effort. Someone else asked a question about why would the Black communities trust that things are going to be different, and I think the answer to that is we're going to get results. So if you talk about death in custody, in no way trying to deflect from the seriousness of any death in custody and the damage it does to trust and confidence. Actually, any death, never mind in custody, but following police contact, is scrutinised by the Independent Office for Police Conduct. And there are various thematic reports to which policing will respond. And actually, as Dave says, the college is responsible for setting approved accredited professional practice, for setting codes of the way in which things are done, including in custody. We're also responsible for example, medical interventions that officers or detention officers should be trained to deliver. This is we're having an honest conversation here. My own view is that actually the panel probably wouldn't see a sea change in some of the issues affecting deaths in custody, that people would say, there we done, we've reduced it by 50% or to whatever the number is, let's say 15 to 5. I actually think that that this plan will probably see far greater progress in lower level aspects of police culture and treatment of Black communities on an everyday basis, which actually will make the way in which the police are perceived, trusted and dare to serve our Black communities. And I am of the view actually that if we get those smaller things right, the big things will actually fall into place. So there has been an awful lot of effort and scrutiny around treatment and death in custody. So I think but it's for the panel to say, look, we think you should spend most of your effort doing this and not that. We are here to genuinely listen to you in the formulation of the plan. So I think this is probably a start of a discussion today, and by no means the end of it, but I've been honest in my answer about where I think the panel can make a big difference. That's my view.
Abby, if I just start on the back of it, it's important, I think, that what we don't try and imagine is that this programme will replace existing statutory structures that exist to deal with these issues. So we do have representatives from HMIC. We also have representative from the Independent Office of Police Conduct on the board. You're probably aware the IOPC does thematic work. It does work to look at particular areas around policing. Part of the reason for their membership is they, rather other than just investigating individual cases, they also produce reports on trends and activities. Custody is an area where they're very attentive. So what we won't try and do is duplicate work of other statutory bodies, and there are quite a lot of people actually in the area around police custody in any case, but some aspects definitely will be picked up in the powers work stream.
I think also something that the programme will need to be really sensitive to is that I think a lot of people in Black communities have felt very let down by the IOPC and its predecessor, the IPCC, in terms of some of the decisions which have come out of those processes and the frameworks there. And so I think it would be useful for the ISOB to be able to feed into where they feel those shortcomings are originating from, and seeing if there are things that can be done to make those organisations work either more transparently or to change kind of their purview and their interaction with people from Black communities and so on. But of course, obviously, it's a complicated area given the remit that we have with this plan. But what is important to note, isn't it, is that the IOPC is represented on the programme board for the plan of action. And so there is that direct line of feedback that's available between actors within the programme and people from agencies like the IOPC and HMIC FRS and so on. So the bodies that already exist to scrutinise areas of policing are being incorporated into this plan of action, which in turn means that there is an aspect of scrutiny that is available to the board over their interactions and over their functions as well, or at the very least a direct line of feedback around concerns that are felt by Black communities. So I know that doesn't quite deal with establishing exactly how it is that death in custodies would be dealt with through the board functions, but certainly I hope that you can see that there is overlap there and there is scope for that to come into the programme and come into being dealt with there. So a question here from Rachel: would working with a government body such as HMP or similar be considered a conflict of interest? I would just say that what you would need to do is to highlight exactly what your function is within that organisation, and then it can be considered whether or not that does amount to a conflict of interest. And again, Jalil is your man. Get in touch with him if you think that there is a possibility of that, and we can move forward from there. So here, a question from Alex. Often I see quantitative data, for example, how many police officers have been given unconscious bias training, Will this panel also have the ability to dive deeper into this? So regarding training, actually reviewing the material and delivery? Yes, is the kind of short answer to that. Again, just bearing in mind that the role of the board is to scrutinise that. So actually built into the action plan within the work streams. For example, with unconscious bias training, you'd look at the internal culture and inclusivity aspect of the plan. The view is that the team there, the work stream there, would look substantively at the training which is being received, consider whether or not that is adequate. They would prepare reports which would feed into the programme board. The programme board prepares reports which feed into the ISOB. And if there is anything that the ISOB feels it needs to have much more of a substantive review over, we have the ability to ask for data, and we have the ability to ask for the primary material to consider and to see whether or not it matches the description and whether or not it's adequate. A more general question here that we have, would the ISOB have scrutiny over the implementation of the plan? And if so, what are the proposed checks and balances being considered to measure successes and failings? Okay, so yeah, the ISOB does have scrutiny over the implementation of the plan. That's its function, is to scrutinise the implementation of the plan. What are the proposed checks and balances being considered to measure successes and failings? Once a plan is developed, the board will feed back into whether or not it thinks that the targets which are being set out by the police are sufficient, realistic and measurable. And that will be the purpose of the meetings and its functionality. Another question, what's the expected term for a board member? That's set out in the recruitment pacts, which is that it's a 4-year plan with an initial recruitment term of 2 years. 2 years, which is reviewed then annually after that. And as you've heard from Dave and Andy, it's a possibility that the whole thing will be refreshed, there's a possibility that personnel will be kept on, but at this moment in time, it's being targeted as a 4-year plan. I understand there's not a solid delivery date. What are the key milestones to be achieved, for example, in the next 2 years? And if this isn't understood, we run the risk of constantly moving things to the right. Again, once the action plan is out, then those milestones and those targets can be bottomed out. Hopefully you heard at the beginning of the webinar discussion around what initial success factors would look like to Dave and to Andy. How much historic data will be available to understand the impact of the plan, i.e. to do an A to B test. The beauty of the proposal behind this plan is that the Independent Scrutiny and Oversight Board will have access to whatever data is necessary for us to carry out our functions. So yeah, obviously that would mean a comparison of current data to historic data in order to properly contextualise those matters. We've got a more general question here, which I think is quite interesting. What is your view, Dave and Andy, of zero tolerance towards racism?
So I think actions speak louder than words. When I was chief in Oakham and Somerset, I got told that one of my white supervisors had made a racially derogative, used a racially derogative term towards mixed heritage member of staff, a colleague, and that she had received a final written warning for it. When I discovered this to my team, including the legal people who said that I wasn't allowed to do this, that the person wasn't going to work for me by the end of the day, and indeed that became the event that happened. I viewed the employment of such a person within the police as a contradiction of our values, never mind our code of ethics. That was nothing. There's a whole different issue about police conduct and the police conduct process, which we could spend some time listening to and understanding. But one of the aspects of it is that legally qualified chairs chair gross misconduct panels, whether the conduct has been committed or what the sanction should be. Now, admittedly, they're one of a board of 3, and one of those people is a senior police officer from the same force. But actually, in a case, again, in my old force, where a racial slur was used and whistleblown. There's a lot of good people in policing. Never underestimate that whistleblower. The panel didn't dismiss, and I judicially reviewed it. I lost the judicial review, but you can only do your best. I think actually trying was an important statement for me to make. Everybody knew that I tried, including the Black Police Association. And so actually, I don't think there is a place for racism in policing. That's my view.
If you're committed to be an organisation that's actively anti-racist, then you can't have toleration for racism, can you? So I don't think there's anything difficult about that kind of statement. I think there are two issues that follow from it, though. So the point Andy makes is, that we should be quite clear. Actually, the government reformed issues around policing. So actually, in many cases of misconduct, I have no ability to sack my staff. It's decided by an independent panel. There are some cases where officers are subject to what we call accelerated procedures, where they are, if they've committed a criminal offence, something like that, where it comes to the chief constable. But we do have a process where, for our police officers, it's independent panels that do this. And as Andy says, you've probably seen that there are a number of examples across the country where chiefs are judicially reviewing their panels to overturn decisions. We've got one here in the West Midlands where we took our panel chair to judicial review to actually overturn and won, and as a result, the kind of officer was subsequently sacked. So you see examples of that, I think, across policing. Personally, I think it should never have been taken away from policing, because I've got to be accountable for the people I employ, and I should be accountable for the decisions I make around that. But that's where we are. I think the other issue that is behind this comment also is, of course, that there are occasions where we feel the behaviour that somebody might experience is racist, but there is not an overt demonstration through racist language or behaviour. And I think those are issues we're more alert to and aware to. And we have to look at the facts as to how that happens, because these things are not as overt sometimes as perhaps they were in the past. And so that an approach to being actively anti-racist and having a zero tolerance for it also has to look at where we see conduct and behaviour that we would clearly assume and is felt is informed by racism, but may not be demonstrably expressed that way in terms of language.
Thank you both. Okay, so a theme of questions which have come up both in the chat and in the Q&A section are we looking at the intersectionality of experiences of Black people as victims, witnesses and suspects, or measures only be on race and ethnicity? Well, if I can approach that in terms of the way the board would be looking at it, I think it's actually at intersectional points that you see the highest levels of racial disparity. And I think that one aspect which really needs to be emphasised through this, and it's something that I'll be pushing in terms of scrutiny around this, is that very often people assume that when you see a racial disparity, it's because Black people do things because they're Black, or we as Black people are not solely motivated by our skin colour when it comes to making decisions. So I think that what really needs to be emphasised in this is looking at the granular of Black experiences and the range of Black experiences, and that will be something that will be pushed forward through the scrutiny aspects from my board, certainly. When you coincide being Black and a woman, then very clearly you can see like an enhancement in terms of racial disparities in some areas. When you look at the differences between people of Black African versus Black Caribbean heritage, you can see vestiges of racial disparity there. There's no coincidence, I think, that you actually see much lower levels of trust from people who are of Black Caribbean descent compared to Black African descent. And so yes, thank you very much for that question. That need for nuance, that need for intersectionality will be very much at the heart of the approach which will be taken by the board, because I think it's very, very important that we don't reduce Black experiences to a monolith, and it's important to allow for that room to see all of those things. And someone has said, yes, also Black and being LGBTQ+I, yes, all of those aspects, protected characteristics, socioeconomic factors will all need to come into the way that these matters are considered. And I think that's another aspect that will be really important in terms of the use of data. One thing which I've definitely noticed as somebody who doesn't have a background specifically in data, but somebody who analyses evidence in my work, is I think the data gathering in relation to Black experiences can be quite poor. Even if we go to the trust deficit statistics which are being used at the moment around policing, when you actually go to the Office of National Statistics and you look at the number of Black people that were spoken to when they were analysing that trust deficit, it's in the hundreds. When you look at the number of white people that are spoken to in terms of levels of trust in policing, it's in the thousands. And so that's something that also needs to be tackled. The interaction and the opportunity given to Black people from different experiences to explain why they feel things happen in the way that they do, what their backgrounds are, what motivates them, and so on, what pushes them in those directions. So yeah, that is very much something that I think needs to be embedded into this plan and properly explored and got to grips with. Did you guys have anything further to add in terms of that intersectionality question? We've got 5 minutes to go. So after this, I think we're going to move towards our last question. No? Okay. So the last question I have reserved to ask Dave, Andy, and Jalil as well, because I'm aware, Jalil, I've sort of like shot some questions at you as and when we've had recruitment specific ones, but we've not actually needed to bother you as much over the last couple of hours. So the last questions I wanted to ask you guys was, in your personal lives, what have you been doing to make sure that you're incorporating anti-racism work in your day-to-day? I'm happy to kind of answer from, I'll answer that initially. So my background is working at the bar as a barrister, but also I belong to an interracial family. I have white members of my family, I have Black members of my family. And I think that something that I have seen a lot of in recent years is that push to no longer just have my conversations around racism with my Black friends and my Black colleagues, where very often I feel like actually we're sort of re-traumatizing each other by holding those conversations with one another, knowing full well that those are the things that we see. And so I've really pushed myself to have those conversations more openly and to challenge more openly in environments where I wasn't previously. And I think that actually it's made me a better barrister. It's made me really question my place in my profession and whether or not the work that I'm doing pushes for a fairer system for people who share my skin colour. And I think that I've reaped the rewards of that through improving my kind of like professional functions in that way, but also it's meant that I think my clients are able to see more clearly that I really am fighting for their corner in terms of defence work with them. So questions for you guys, similar questions. Jill, do you want to go? Because we haven't heard from you, and then we can go to Andy and Dave. So what have you been doing in terms of anti-racism work in your day-to-day life? And obviously as a Black person, it's an interesting question to ask, isn't it? Because I don't think we get asked this question that much. Just like, I live, therefore I am. So, yeah.
I mean, as I was saying before, before we started, in regards to, what this board is potentially going to do. Obviously, growing up Black, of course, I've actually experienced a lot of racism growing up and everything, and not just in a Sunday league football game or with a group of friends who didn't know it was racist at the time or so on and so forth. But growing up, and especially joining a company like Inclusive Board, you kind of learn a bit more in terms of how to speak to people about it, and also how to educate them in regards to what to say and how to treat others around you. Because just because we're close, in a working organization or even as friends, someone else might take a deeper offense, and wrong means wrong and right means right at the end of the day, and that's how I've always seen it. So yeah, again, joining inclusive boards and spreading awareness of diversity and inclusion has had a massive effect on how I now speak and how I educate people in terms of race. So I do a lot of talks, not just to friends but to candidates I speak to day to day, because as you're aware, I speak to people from all kinds of corners, whether it be people with disabilities, getting more women on board, for example, people from the LGBTQ plus community as well, just expressing and educating how important diversity and inclusion is. And that's kind of what I do day to day. And you love your job when you educate people outside of work and you speak to them outside of work in regards to race and everything along them lines. But yeah, that's pretty much my lived experience, and that's what I do day to day.
Andy?
So I also come from an interracial family. So my sister-in-law is British Nigerian, and she's called Adenike, and she believes in the pledge that I've made to be anti-racist. But believe me, if you live in an interracial family, then there are difficult issues you need to deal with. And I hope that I've been a good ally to Adenike and supported her with my obviously otherwise white family. I've involved Adenike in my work in Hampshire and Avon and Somerset, to help support me in that respect, but hopefully support her as well. I'm a father of two daughters, and I hope that through helping educate them with my sister-in-law about Black history in Britain, and that's a thing that you've got to go looking for. It doesn't necessarily get rubbed in your face, but there's lots of Black history in Britain, and it's not all stuff that we want to be proud of, but I still think we need to understand it. I hope that I've raised them to understand what racism is and how to respect difference and be inclusive in their lives.
I always find on these events that I find myself in reflection. I don't seem to have much in personal life because I spend my life at work. But I suppose the bits I'd say is so I haven't always seen the issues about racism. We join policing because we believe in fairness. We're in policing because we want to protect people and help people. But my background is a kind of white working class background in Manchester, and I had very little contact with anybody who was Black until I actually joined the police, and was frankly straight away tossed into, I think, the animosity between Black people and the police service right from the start of my early career. That's why I met lots of the first Black people I met were often the people I was enforcing the law around, and I would say, I've gone through the cathartic element of actually, I hope now, seeing the issues from other shoes. And so I think my job as a senior police leader is to be a thought leader and constantly look to try and trigger in others, I think, the cathartic moment that they kind of see things from others' perspective. They realise that actually, I don't have to define myself as a white man. I'm just able to be Dave, but people of colour, Black women, they are defined by their ethnicity much more visibly. And I think it's really hard for white people and white men to see that. I work incredibly hard, I think, to be a thought leader in the organisation around that, to change that, to make the organisation fair. But actually, critically, I often think the out of work thing is as a dad. My daughters, haven't grown up in a neighbourhood and a community where they've met lots of Black people. They actually have a lot of contact through my job. I've always socialised them, I think, at Kira's stages when they were little. Happy days when I was the chief superintendent at my side, we would go to community events because, frankly, they just did not see that world. And I think my piece around this is really, I recognise I haven't always seen that world. I haven't always seen it that way, and it's to trigger the cathartic reflection in others that I think is so important to actually understand this agenda and to buy into it with passion, which should be really easy for us as police officers because we fundamentally join because we believe in fairness and justice.
Great. Well, guys, I'm going to wrap up. This is a rare occasion where, as a barrister, I'm actually finishing something on time, which has allowed me to talk, so that's great. So thank you ever so much to the three of you for participating in this webinar. We were actually saying that it would be really good to review this towards the end of the plan, or maybe even just in a year, to see if we have lived up to our own expectations and to the expectations of those who participated by joining as attendees to this webinar. So maybe you'll see us again, kind of like reflecting on where we've gone with this. If anybody wants further details, remember to go to the Police ISOB website, which is www.policeisob.co.uk, where you can see contact details for the board to remain in contact. And I'll send an email round to attendees with the video for this webinar, which will be uploaded onto YouTube. And I hope to see lots of applications from you. You've been a really engaging and engaged audience. Thank you very much for giving us your 2 hours on a weekday evening to find out more about this programme. All right, guys, thank you very much.
Thank you.